Disclaimer right up front, I'm a veterinarian and I'm going to share some thoughts with you that are kind of coming from a personal level, from personal experience, and of course some observations that have been made on this particular subject from a variety of different angles. So if you look at this issue, I think of it myself usually from this perspective as a veterinarian, as I say. And if I look at the veterinarian's oath, which we all take at graduation, the line that kind of sticks out to me is the prevention or relief of animal suffering, because that's pretty much, I think, what a lot of us get into this whole thing for. And one of the things I think we learned very early on, if we didn't kind of understand that before we got into it, is that one of the ways we relieve animal suffering is euthanasia. And I try to explain that to our veterinary students. I think from time to time they probably understand this, but some almost are somewhat disillusioned by the fact that this is a big part of what you do. This is a major component of your day-to-day work. And I think it's important that they understand that, and I think particularly those, before they get into this profession, need to understand that euthanasia is one of those things that you can't escape. It's just inherent in everything that we do, that's a possibility. I think it's also challenging for us as veterinarians because just looking at this, for example, by Manette, it says, veterinarians are trained to help in nature's healing process, but we also treat our patients with the knowledge that some of them will be ultimately slaughtered for human use. At other times, we're called upon to perform euthanasia, but not always for humane or medical reasons. And I think I see this a lot in some of our students from time to time, looking at the slaughter of animals for human consumption. Believe it or not, there's a lot of people who have struggles with that, real struggles with that. And I think that's normal. I mean, I think we should expect that, of course. Not everybody has possibly had the same, surely had the same experience leading up to their work, becoming a veterinarian or an animal scientist, dairy scientist. And so everybody comes from a little different background and has a little different experiences relative to these things. And then, of course, I think the even more difficult one for me personally, frankly, is euthanasia to manage overpopulation of dogs and cats. And I think that one's more troubling for me because I had to do that. When I was in practice, we made our monthly visit to the dog pound, local dog pound and animal shelters, and euthanize dogs for them. And it was a rotating schedule, thank God, so that we didn't have to be the one to do it all the time. But I tell you that is, without doubt, the most complicated situation to ever be faced with. So these are just a couple of examples, and I'll share some others here. But just to mention this euthanasia to manage overpopulation of dogs and cats, I think, again, we don't talk near enough about euthanasia in our veterinary schools, in our animal science departments. We just not talk about it. I don't know why. We should be, right? This is a critical part of this whole business, whether you're a companion animal person or a livestock person. You need to understand these things. But if you look at these statistics, I think they're really sobering, right? This is just the ASPCA's website of the 5 to 7 million companion animals entering shelters nationwide each year. 3 to 4 million of those, that's 60% of the dogs, 70% of the cats, are euthanized. That's a very disturbing figure, I think, right? A very disturbing figure. At least it should be. I think it's really an issue that really I wish there was a better solution for. I'll share with you here a little video that I kind of get a kick out of.
Honey, we need to talk.
About sex.
Yeah, we think you should be having it, sweetie.
A lot of it.
Get up there and nail everything you can.
If it's got a pulse, you should be wrapped around it.
What if I get pregnant?
So what? You should pop out all the kids you want.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we can leave them in the shelter, dump them in the street, whatever.
It's really not important.
I'm really glad we had this little talk.
My little girl's gonna get some.
Most of us haven't had that talk, I don't believe. But anyway, I mean, it makes a great point, doesn't it? And you notice that this was made by PETA. I don't agree with a lot of the things that maybe PETA stands for, but they got this one right, for sure, right? They got this one right. So it's a huge issue, and one that we really have to be, I think, honest with ourselves about. You can't know enough about how to deal with these situations. So the other way, and it's been termed in a number of different ways, the caring and killing paradox is one way that you'll hear this discussed in many cases. There's been a number of actual studies done on this. Probably one of the more famous one is one by Arluc from years ago. But it points out that this is a problem that's experienced by laboratory animal technicians, young people in 4-H and FFA programs, many more. And there are some very real issues that develop as a consequence of dealing with the process of euthanasia. Depression, grief, other destructive behaviors, alcoholism, drug abuse, and so forth. And so it is a huge issue. And again, I think that our biggest mistake is not dealing with it, talking quite enough about it. The techniques themselves are not that complicated. The emotional issues became very difficult at times. Certainly on the farm, I think we expect our workers who care for these animals, they hope to see them prosper, of course. They become attached to these animals. They develop an emotional attachment to them naturally, as we kind of hope they do, because that helps them improve the work that they do for us in those areas. But when injury or illness occurs, then all of a sudden we expect them to, turn off that caring feeling and turn around to that one of where they need to do euthanasia. And I think we really struggle in a lot of our operations in getting euthanasia conducted in timely fashion simply because we're asking something that is counter to what everybody wants to do, right? It's just unnatural for us. And so for us as veterinarians, for us as livestock owners, this is a real challenge. Euthanasia of down debilitated animals, I consider that easier, but certainly not easy, right? Even in this situation, I think we struggle to get it done at times. But then take the euthanasia of a normal animal, an animal that has no injury or debilitation. Now you're talking about something that's really difficult. Thank goodness we've got good market conditions right now for dairy calves, but that's always an issue for us when we didn't have a good market. So I hope it stays like it is, because that's a tough thing right there. But all of our industries struggle with some of those kinds of things, and so sometimes it's market conditions. This is nothing more than market conditions that put us into these very difficult situations. I also think there's a misconception from time to time. I like this from Jessica Lauren, practitioner in Kansas. She says, I've had to euthanize cows for producers who could not do it for themselves. Many producers become very attached to the animals they care for, and they get a true satisfaction in caring for the animals in their possession. Absolutely right. I think sometimes we have an image in the livestock industry as not being quite as sensitive, maybe, as the companion animal folks are. I don't see that. You see, I don't see that at all. I think that's a very unfortunate kind of a situation. This is what I see far more. I remember had there's a large dairy in Florida I worked with a lot, and one of the dairymen said to me, he says, I've got thousands of cows. He says, but I can't euthanize any of them. He says, but you can take me out, and he's of course an avid hunter, and he says, I have no problem shooting a deer. But he says, I sure don't like to shoot any of my cows. Strange, right? But I think it shows that there is a bond there that sometimes is misunderstood. I share some thoughts with you from Bernard Rollin, because he says some things that I think are really worth thinking about. And I think this is helpful. To treat animals morally requires that we understand their mentational limits. For example, if you look at the way animals think versus how humans think, you have to understand the power of thought and reasoning in the context of their suffering. So look at what he has to say here. First of all, human thought is irreducibly tied to language, which allows us entry into modes of thought that are essentially closed to animals as a consequence. If you think about it, humans think in abstract terms, logic or mathematics, you see. In negative terms, there are no dragons in the library. In conditional terms, if it rains, we'll hold graduation indoors, and so forth. You see, these are modes of thought that really don't fit in animals, of course. Animals are able to endure, or humans are able to endure short-run negative experiences for the purpose of achieving long-term goals. Examples might be the person who diets to lower blood pressure, right? People who memorize large volumes of material, boring material at that, for the sake of gaining admission to veterinary school or whatever. So you see, these are modes of thought that are quite common for us as humans, but they don't exist in animals. And it's important, I think, to talk about that with people who have this task at hand so that they can get beyond the challenge of anthropomorphizing this thing to the point that it makes them or paralyzes them from doing what needs to be done. I think we as veterinarians learn how to do that very early on. We have to, right? So we need to keep in mind that it's unlikely that animals understand the concepts of life and death. Instead, they understand only the pleasure and pain associated with life and death, right? To an animal, and in their mind, you see, there's only quality of life. It's painful or not, they're hungry or not, or they're thirsty or not. And so the here and now is kind of where they're at. And so in the suffering situation, and if we keep this in mind and understanding this, I think it makes it easier, I hope, for us to do what we need to do what we know isn't the right thing. Doesn't mean that we won't suffer some of the moral stress that comes with that. And again, I lean on Bernie here. He talks about how this arises in people whose life work is aimed at promoting the well-being of animals. That's all of us. The shelter veterinarian or worker responsible for euthanizing unwanted dogs and cats. I tell you, I couldn't do that. I couldn't be a shelter veterinarian. I look at all those folks who do that in our profession. Thank God. I couldn't do it, right? I couldn't do it. But the similar situation, the researcher who finds himself or herself complicit in the creating of pain or distress or disease and other noxious situations that are demanded by a research protocol, I don't want to do those things. I don't want to do those things, right? Thank God there are people who do, right? But there are a number of situations, not just euthanasia, that put us into these very difficult situations. I think it's also important, and I think a lot of us can identify with this, as pet owners, right? Various surveys have been conducted on the percentage of pet owners who view their animals as members of the family. We've got a cat. She's pretty much a member of the family. She gets treated pretty good, right? I mean, real good. And the lowest number attributes 88% pet-owning population. The highest describes it to 98% of the population considers their pet part of the family. And I think we all do, but most of us recognize there's a limit there, okay? We can place those boundaries, but the reality is a lot of people cannot. And they walk into our veterinary clinics every single day, right? And so I think it's important to understand this, because this is the way most people look at this, because their relationship with animals is predominantly as a pet owner, not as a livestock owner, right? And so the way they look at these things and the struggles that we have in our industries today in dealing with consumer concerns and some of the activist groups is because this is kind of how they look at all animal-human connections. For instance, as animals have continued to become recognized as members of the family, people have become more and more reluctant to euthanize them. We have hospice care. We teach that in our veterinary schools. We sure didn't do that when I went through, but that's an important program now in veterinary medicine because people want those kinds of things. In fact, what that's led to is the other stress that we deal with so many times is trying to help people move to the point of making a decision to euthanize an animal as opposed to trying to keep it going. In other words, prolonging life rather than prolonging death rather than prolonging life situations, right? Very difficult. And all those things take a toll on us emotionally, right? The impact of moral stress, a recent UK study indicates that the rate of suicide in the veterinary profession is at least 3 times that observed in the general population. And a lot of it has to do with dealing with some of these stresses. That's why I feel it's so important that from time to time we talk about them, we deal with them. And of course I'm talking about this at all different levels, okay, not simply the farm situation, but I'm trying to get us to understand that these issues go far deeper than just what we see on the surface in terms of dealing with these in the day-to-day operations of our businesses. Euthanasia, compassion fatigue, it's emotional exhaustion caused by the stress of caring for traumatized or suffering animals or people. There's been a lot written on this, of course. It's characterized by emotional depression. People are prone to sudden outbursts of anger, near constant feeling of sadness, persons near the point of tears, etc., all the time, depression. All the kinds of things that we see here, important things for us to recognize in people who may be dealing with this thing on a regular basis. They may be employees. Sometimes, like I say, it's veterinarians. We need to see that when we're starting to feel some of these ways, maybe it's time to back away and find something else to do or take a good vacation for a little while. Persons with these kinds of problems will show isolation from family and friends, have problems relating to co-workers or the public. And of course, we see folks who struggle with these things, and possibly these are some of the issues they're coping with. Feel exhausted, are ill, develop frequent health problems, and so forth. And there are effects on the intellectual capacity and your intellectual abilities and spiritually effects. So it's important and it's not to be overlooked. Terry Whiting, some of you might know Dr. Terry Whiting from Canada, talks about what he calls perpetuation-induced traumatic stress, which he has experienced himself in situations where he's been involved in mass depopulation situations. Those are really difficult, right? Those really work on people. If you read the accounts of anyone who's been involved in mass depopulation situations, boy, they really struggle. You know, can you imagine a week of killing animals? You know, they're healthy, totally healthy animals in most cases, for the purposes of disease control. Terry talks about it, and he talks about how he spent a good week in a rehab facility trying to overcome the challenges that he endured emotionally in just being involved in those kinds of situations. So I think it's important we recognize that this is not a simple issue, this is a real issue. And our people that we have working on our farms are going to have difficulty with these kinds of things. I read something I share with you for a minute that I have found, I think, useful, possibly in understanding this thing a little bit, that so many people struggle with the basic issue of death, period, right? I mean, I don't think it's anything anybody wants to talk about. It's not anything that any of us are really maybe given enough time and effort to understanding where we're at with this kind of issue. But it's been described by Dr. Simon as the universal rhythm of life, this birth, death, and rebirth. It's just the universal rhythm of life, is one way to look at it. It's the central theme in Christianity, but it's in many other world religions as well. Christ was born, crucified, third day resurrected from death. But it's consistent with the cycle of the seasons, demonstrated by the cycle of molecules and cells within our bodies. This life is just one grand rhythm of birth, death, and resurrection. We don't have any problem with the birth part or the rebirth part. It's that death part in the middle that's a little bit troublesome, right? But this universal rhythm of life embraces the view that the miracle of death is equivalent to the miracle of birth. It's hard to look at it that way, you see. To honor death as a miracle equivalent to birth is one of the most challenging struggles of mankind. So part of this is really at the base of all of these challenges we deal with in dealing with this thing. I think a lot of folks struggle too with the fact that directly or indirectly, every human being, every living thing must kill to survive. Somehow we've forgotten that, haven't we? Seems to me like we have. There are no options, right? Life is fueled by death. That's just how it is. I like this. Even those who feast upon vegetables and fruits to avoid participating in the slaughter of animals are simply playing intellectual mind games. What right does anyone have to create a hierarchy of life forms where killing of plants is acceptable while the killing of animals is not? I never looked at it quite that way, but that's kind of interesting, isn't it? An interesting way to look at it. And so those who criticize us for eating meat have no problem killing plants, right? Is the way you could look at that. So the insect eats the plant. Sometimes the plant eats the insect, so there's some retribution there. The bird eats the insect, and the cat eats the bird, right? That's how it all works. That's how it all works. And somehow, crazy as it seems, somehow along the line we've forgotten that somehow, right? So many people in society just don't seem to understand that that's just how it all works. But it's all part of nature's magnificent plan, right? And it would be nice if we could all see it that way. But I think somehow in society today, we've become so displaced from where our food comes from and how it gets where it does that people just don't understand that. Well, check out this. The cheetah is the fastest land animal, right? It eats the impala. Or does it? Not always, huh? Don't you love it when that happens, huh? But is how everything works, right? It is how it all works. So our challenge is acceptance of the concept of killing to survive in many respects, you know. Although we depend on them for survival, we shroud all of our killing floors, our packing plants in secrecy. It bothers me that when I went to veterinary school, boy, we went through packing plants. We got to see it all, right? Whether we wanted to or not. That doesn't happen today. That doesn't happen today so much, you know, and I think it's a problem. People have the option, you see, to opt out of the day at the packing plant. No, I don't think that's good. I think if we're veterinarians, I think if we're animal scientists, I think we need to expose ourselves to the way our food is produced. We need to come to grips with that, and we need to get over some of these challenges. But I think that throughout society today, the problem is people are just seldom ever forced to understand how it all gets in the freezer case, and that killing is a part of participation in life, no matter who you are, and whether you're human or animal, right? Temple Grandin has also made some observations from looking at folks who work in packing plants. And she's watched how they cope with the stress of killing. And I just share this with you. Some of you may be aware of this and have read this before. But she talks about stunners, bleeders, and the people who drive animals to stun box in packing plants use basically three types of coping strategies. One is a mechanical approach to the task, the same way that whenever I was euthanizing dogs and cats, I just focused on hitting veins. I tried not to pay any attention to anything more than just that, right? You distance yourself from the reality of that. Now, that's not an authentic way of dealing with it, but that's how you get it done. It's mechanical, right? You become a machine. And we have to become a machine. Whether we're euthanizing piglets that may be ill, whether we're euthanizing calves, we're euthanizing cows, we have to become mechanical to some extent to get done what we know we have to do. So the mechanical approach is a critical part of this thing. A few are sadists, really don't have any place in a packing plant, don't have any place anywhere near animals, but there's a few there that sneak their way into. They actually enjoy killing and inflicting pain. And then some actually see their work in a sense of a sacred ritual, as she describes it. In other words, a more respectful kind of approach to the work that they do, such as that's applied by those who do ritual slaughter. The shokat, for kosher slaughter, for halal slaughter, they approach these things, with dignity and respect when it's done right. You see? That's the way it should be done, right? That's the way it should be done. So the mechanical approach, as Temple talks about it, the box stapler. No emotions involved in the act of killing. They do not talk to the animals. You see, they don't allow themselves to develop any kind of an association. Have you ever noticed if you name something, it's almost impossible to euthanize it, right? I love to watch people backyard folks who name something and then struggle desperately to euthanize it or to send it to slaughter if it's a livestock. The first few killings for the mechanical approach people are upsetting and unpleasant, but then the person becomes habituated and the killing act becomes a reflex without emotion. It can actually become a bad thing at that stage, right? And so for people who work mechanically, and I remind myself of this, because I think we as veterinarians are really prone to becoming mechanical so we can get these things done. But it does make us insensitive to some extent if we're not careful. The reality is box staplers are pretty good workers. They're pretty good at euthanizing animals, but their feelings about slaughtering animals lack authenticity, and eventually, you see, that can become problematic. That can become problematic. The sadistic person, of course, enjoys killing. They achieve pleasure from dominating, mistreating, or otherwise causing physical harm to animals. The attitude may be characterized as one where you might hear them say, oh, they're just animals, it doesn't really hurt them. It's going to die in a few minutes anyhow, so why worry about what happens now? You see, by devaluing the animal, the person justifies in their mind the cruel things that they do to it. That's the sadist. There's no place for those anywhere near livestock, for sure. As a sacred ritual, you see, the killing of animals takes on a whole different kind of meaning, and probably a much healthier one for all of us. And regardless of our situation, we can apply this in any situation where we're forced or into a situation where we need to euthanize something. But multiple societies have slaughter ceremonies, you know. The American Indians dance around the campfire after successful hunts in celebration for that is respectful. See, respectful. And it's been practiced by people throughout the ages. And again, as I say, Judaism and many of our religions place great significance and great seriousness to the act of killing and taking a life, you see. And that's good. Because when we ritualize it, you see, it places controls on the act of killing and prevents it from getting out of control. It prevents us from that being that mechanical person that over time has done it so much that they get so insensitive that, you see, it begins to deteriorate. No, we want to be sensitive to it. We want to understand what we're doing. This is Temple's approach. She treats the slaughter of animals as a sacred ritual. I think this is interesting. She says, when she enters a packing plant, she bows her head in silence and reverence for the animals that die there. Reverence, respect, you see. On packing plant facilities that she's designed, she inscribes the words, Stairway to Heaven, or Valhalla. She has one in Georgia. That is the true stairway to heaven. If you've ever been in that packing plant in Georgia. I've been there many times. And so, yeah, this is the way to approach it. And I think what we're trying to do, what I try to do, in making the task of euthanasia less stressful, is, and first of all, on farms, select people carefully for this role. Right? We don't want to select somebody who has sadistic tendencies if we think that's possible, and hopefully there wouldn't be anybody on that farm like that anyhow, but it needs to be the job of more than one or two people. And sometimes it needs to be the manager, sometimes it's an owner that takes on that task. But it needs to be somebody, you know, who's capable of dealing with this issue. Not everybody is. People need to be aware. The people themselves, owners, managers, are the signs of compassion fatigue. I went through them very quickly, but I think we all understand when people are struggling emotionally with these things. And then I think one of the really important things is to make sure that people are properly trained and that they have the proper equipment to do this thing, right? That really becomes a critical part of getting it done. They need to know the anatomical sites for conducting euthanasia and the animals that they work with. I think that's so important, and I'm so glad to see programs like the Firearm program. The pork industry has done a fantastic job, you see, and we in the cattle industry are kind of coming around here now to getting these things right, because we need to make sure that people know how to do this thing and do it right. This is still one of our biggest problems, is that people don't know the exact proper sites for conducting euthanasia in a farm situation. I shudder to say that sometimes veterinarians are still using old ideas in terms of this, and this is something that we in our own profession are trying desperately to correct and change. But when we're training on-farm people how to do this thing, this is absolutely critical. What we're trying to hit is about that big in that brain. And so our anatomical site selection is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. And there's enough resources out there now that this should not be an issue for us, right? The Pork Board has a great set of tools. The AABP has a great brochure. There's all kinds of information out there. This is not something that we should be struggling with. We just need to make sure that people understand it and make sure that we teach this. We need to make sure that they know the proper firearms to use and the proper ammunition to use. The .22 rifle is one of the most common firearms anywhere, but it's not sufficient for consistent euthanasia of adult cattle, and particularly adult cattle that may be quite mature. That skull gets harder, or for euthanizing bulls, we need higher caliber firearms. So we need to make sure that people know this, and we need to make sure when we're out on that farm that they're using the right kind of ammunition. They're not using hollow points, but they're using solid point bullets. Many folks in the industry, and Merck is one, who has a video. Some of you have possibly seen it, but a video not only on euthanasia, but on a number of issues that relate to on-farm issues, and that's so good. There's so many materials, there's so many opportunities out there for us now to get this thing right. This shouldn't be a problem. We need to make sure that people understand what constitutes unconsciousness. What constitutes unconsciousness? When they use a captive bolt or they use a firearm, how do we know the animal's unconscious? How do we know the animal's unconscious? Every animal that I euthanize, I'm looking for every one of those. And I never leave that animal until I'm absolutely sure that animal's unconscious. And then I'm going to also stay there until I've confirmed death. So many places I go, I see people that want to shoot the animal and leave. I know why they want to leave. It's part of what we're talking about here. It's not pleasant to sit around and watch. But the reality is, you don't leave until you've confirmed death, right? Cardiac arrest is confirmation of death. That's how we confirm death. And people need to know that the heart will continue to beat even with an extremely good shot for at least 7 to 8 minutes. Why? Because the heart is controlled by the sinoatrial node, not by the brain. And what stops the heart is anoxia, the lack of oxygen, eventually, because the animal isn't breathing, you see. Simple things that we need to be sure people on farm understand. Make sure they understand. And then we need to let them know that there's other ways to confirm death. Don't rest alone on cardiac arrest. Sometimes that's difficult to determine. But use other indicators, lack of movement after 20 minutes, rigor mortis, and so forth. In summary, we want a good life for animals, right? This is what we think we need to provide animals. And I think it's pretty hard to argue with any of these. One, where an animal has adequate food, water, shelter, protection from predators, compassionate care and handling, right? We've made great strides in recent years in dealing with those issues. Medical care is needed, and a humane death when disease or injury results in uncontrollable suffering. Those are basic, right? Absolute basics for animals, and that's where we need to try to go. Timely euthanasia requires compassionate caregivers who have a clear understanding of the indications for euthanasia. That can be confusing. Who makes the decision? There should be no question about how those decisions get made on the farm. Who's going to make them, and what are the criteria? We need to understand the mentational limits, and I think it's good to talk to people about those things so they understand the differences between themselves and animals. Sometimes that helps to make this thing a little easier. How to approach end-of-life issues for animals with respect and dignity it deserves. That is really critical, too. I think we impart that when we describe this, when we teach people how to do these things. We need to impart that. How to conduct procedures and have the means to do it is really critical, right? I see so many places that they haven't given people proper training, or they don't have the proper equipment to do the job. We need to make sure that that's not an issue. We need to know the signs of moral stress and compassion fatigue. And we need to be looking for it, right? If we're an owner, we're a manager, we've got somebody assigned to that task, we need to make sure that we're watching for these things. And we need to find help for them if that becomes necessary. I think sometimes we just overlook those things as though everybody can do it and that these things aren't important. They're critical, absolutely critical. There are still too many animals die. And it's something we've got to fix. Something we've got to fix, right? And it can be fixed. No one likes to do it. Nobody wants to do it. The decision is not always black and white. And of course, we're all afraid of acting too quickly. It's really important. I think that one of the most important things that we need to be getting done on our livestock operations today, we have to do it, right? We have to do it. I'm glad to see the challenges that have come to us as an industry, in all of our industries. If there's one thing I think that we can thank HSUS, PETA, Mercy for Animals, and all the rest for, is they have made us sensitive to an issue that we weren't and needed to be. And we've changed it, we've fixed it, right? And we need to keep fixing it. And I think it's important that we approach these things right. I think Bernie's absolutely correct when he says, better a week too early than a day too late. Absolutely right.